Cloud, and welcome to the 905er. The matter of bullying and other egregious acts by municipal councillors is something that we've touched upon in this podcast. Councillors bullying their fellow elected officials is unfortunately not an uncommon occurrence. Whether it's the keying of cars or bullying employees, some municipal councillors' behavior is crossing the line. In the real world, you or I would be called into HR and probably fired there on the spot, as we should be for such behavior. The problem with elected officials is that there is no HR. The only time to hold them accountable is at the ballot box, and that is a problem. Because 4 years between elections, a lot can happen. Last term, the Ontario legislature brought forward legislation from opposition parties to address the need for the ability to hold municipal councillors accountable. Those efforts failed. This legislative session, however, the Ontario PCs introduced Bill 9, the Municipal Accountability Act. It is also without noting that the majority of councillors who find themselves on the receiving end of this bullying are women, which is why the website, the womenofOntarioSayNo.com, caught our eye. Many female councillors are backing the grassroots movement led by Emily McIntosh to demand better behavior and accountability at the municipal level. Emily initiated Women of Ontario Say No in August of 2022 as a direct response to the need for accountability for municipally elected representatives, as evidenced in her hometown of Barrie, Ontario. The nonpartisan movement has since grown exponentially since its incorporation. Emily joins me today to talk about the website, the movement, and what we need to expect of behavior from our municipal councillors. Thank you, Emily McIntosh of Women of Ontario Say No.ca for coming on today's episode of the 905 to talk about a topic that, quite frankly, we keep coming back to in one shape, way, or another on this podcast, and that is to talk about the matter of municipal councillor bullying by municipal councillors. Emily, thank you very much for coming on today.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.
So your website, Women of Ontario Say No.ca, we're going to have a link to that in our show notes, folks. Take a click on that to dive in. But give us the Coles notes if you can. Just what is this? What is your organization about, and why did you feel the need that it needed to exist?
Okay, great. So I wouldn't even refer to it as an organization. This is a very grassroots movement. It's both elected and non-elected citizens in this province who know that Ontarians deserve better. Our website is thewomenofOntarioSayNo.com for reference. And just to share that back, oh my gosh, years ago at this point, did by this gap in legislation. It sat with me for a long time. I knew I would do something about it, but I didn't know what at the time. And, this information, it was incredibly upsetting, and it happened to be about a councillor who was also in civil litigation for sexual harassment of a city employee. And then this councillor went on to run for mayor in the city of Barrie. And it was at that point that I had a very visceral reaction, and I thought, you know what, I don't want to live in this risk. And it was really clear that municipally elected than any other person working in this province. It didn't matter how egregious the behavior, anybody would retain their position of power. They were still able to retain their council seat and be making very critical decisions and interacting with council in a very public way, the community. So it was at that time that we came across Bill 5, which was a private member's bill introduced by Stephen Blais of the Liberal Party called the Stopping Harassment and Abuse by Local Leaders Act. At that time, we approached the Conservative government It was a majority government, and we said we need to have legislation on the table. We realized at this point that there was already a lot of communication with government on this from bodies like the Association of Municipalities of Ontario, the Ontario Municipal Administrators Association, but nothing had been done. So we actually started doing presentations to councils across Ontario and connecting with councils across Ontario, asking them to support a motion in support of Bill 5. When Bill 5 was voted down, we continued to have conversations with the Conservative government and a number of ministers there. And then we approached the NDP, who put forward the Municipal Accountability and Integrity Act under Municipal Affairs critic Jeff Birch. So then we approached councils to pass a motion in support of that legislation, and as well as the AMO legislation calling on governments to introduce appropriate accountability has been introduced, Bill 9, the Municipal Accountability Act. But this has been a very collective effort of citizens and people that care and know that the current reality is just not okay.
We've touched upon this before on this podcast years ago. Here in the 905 in Mississauga, there's a councillor, Karen Rass, who was their husband was caught on camera. There's one of her fellow councillors was caught keying her car.
Yes.
In the councillor's parking garage. And again, we get into this whole like, oh, what are they going to do? And they had to go into an in-camera meeting to come up with disciplinary. And that it struck me as how unique this situation is, because it's not a regular workplace. Like you and I were working in the same workplace, and we got into a tit for tat disagreement for whatever reason. We could go to HR in theory and work it out, or a supervisor said, get your act together, guys. That doesn't work at a councillor level, because these people are really accountable to you and I as the electorate. What I just want like your insight into just that unique ability, because the idea is like, well, no, we have to wait every 4 years to put them, they go run to campaign to get their job back, and that's when you say, hey, this person doesn't deserve to have their seat anymore, let's vote them out.
It's created actually a culture of immunity, and it's really interesting what you say. Their accountability is to the public and those who have voted them in, and that is true, but actually their accountability is to every other human being. That's where we need to be operating. And I think it's a paradigm shift. So we take it very seriously. Democracy is the foundation of healthy communities and healthy, provinces and countries. It's a big deal to suggest that somebody be removed. In this advocacy case, we are talking about only the most egregious cases of violence or harassment, and we're really asking for the same standard as any other workplace. So if it would result in termination in the private sector, then it should result in termination. We are not asking people to, be held to a high standard. We are actually asking violent behavior. This is a low bar that we have a lot of confidence that the majority of councillors will meet. And the hope is that the legislation is in fact preventative in nature. And what we find here is that, in any other HR situation, when you're looking to hold somebody accountable and you're doing an investigation, it's called a balance of probabilities. So it is a different threshold than beyond a reasonable doubt. We know a lot of the behavior is not necessarily going to be considered criminal in nature. And in fact, we have instances where the police have been called and they've said, we really don't have enough to be able to, press charges necessarily, but it doesn't necessarily mean that the person should hold their position. So we're really looking for something comparable, but yes, it is nuanced. And that's why with the advocacy effort, we are advocating for added levels of scrutiny. So from the Women of Ontario Say No perspective, if the local integrity commissioner was recommending removal because the act was so egregious, it would go to what we are suggesting be a panel of integrity commissioners. And then from there it would go for judicial review.
So when you talk about your panel of integrity commissioners, you're talking about like a provincially appointed body that sort of
Yeah.
like the
Yes.
land tribunal board or the landlord
Mhm.
dispute board that
Yeah.
counselor and the aggrieved party. Because I should also clarify, you're not talking about just between counselors. You also talk between like counselors and municipal staff as well.
Yes.
Yes.
Oh,
Okay.
yes. And any code of conduct violation, because HR cannot do anything. The only thing that municipalities can do is, if the IC determines that, an act has been egregious, then council can modify, when that counselor is coming in to the premise. I've heard of counselors where the person can only come into the municipal chambers when nobody else is in the building. I mean, this is ridiculous. Or they have to be in the basement. They can't speak with anybody. The maximum pay is a suspension of 90 days of pay, but they're still able to participate. So something is very distorted with this picture. And we just wouldn't do this. And what this has created is a waste of taxpayer dollars. You have municipalities paying out hundreds of thousands of dollars in settlements to, frankly, excuse the poor behavior of councillors because it cannot be appropriately addressed. I mean, those could be community parks. And I think that's how we need the public to think about this and how we need the government to action this. It's very critical.
I, this is going to be anecdotal in my observation, but one thing I notice is this pattern behavior is rarely on newly elected counselors. I find that when we hear about this
Mm-hmm.
kind of bullying or really bad, sexual harassment of staff or other counselors, is usually on the part of a counselor that has been a counselor who has been elected multiple terms. They're kind of a staple of City Hall. They kind of
Mm-hmm.
get their seat. They're good. I know my ward, and they're there for years. Like in some cases, people will say, "Oh, no, that's so and so's seat. They'll only give it up when
Mm-hmm.
they die in office."
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And I'm wondering, like, are we? Do you think there should be further reforms to this system? Like term limits, perhaps, or recall legislation, perhaps brought in to kind of curb this behavior? Because I find it's a matter of, again, there is no, other than at the ballot box, there is no right now legal method of removing somebody. Um, do you think that that we need to do more? Is this like a first step to like a complete overhaul of how we hold our elected officials accountable in between the 4-year election cycle?
That's a great question. I don't know. I think this is a critical first step, and I'll be honest, this has taken
Mhm.
so much work that it's hard to imagine. What I think might be a better approach is to really empower citizens to feel engaged and to create the responsibility throughout communities. It cannot be on the backs of, for example, just women. This isn't just a women's issue. I actually, even though I agree anecdotally, it is a lot of, elected officials that have been elected for a long time. I don't think that's exclusively the case. So
Mhm.
I think really encouraging people to share the load and share the responsibility to demand better. In theory, democracy can work really well if we have, people of integrity operating in those spaces. And I think what is really this legislation, Bill 9, is extremely critical because it will create a standardized code of conduct and it will help standardize how decisions are made in this way. But yes, does the sector need an overhaul? I mean, one of the most glaring conflicts of interest is that municipalities hire if the municipality doesn't like sometimes they fire them. That is a community commissioners. So the space, but those pieces, because I think this is a step one.
Yeah, I want this might be a bit beyond your purview, but I'm going to ask it anyways because I like to hear your opinion on it. One thing that I've covering this, a lot of what we cover is municipal politics on this podcast, and something that has come up is the increasing lack of power that municipalities have. Like they're, as much as we say like, oh, they're in charge of zoning bylaws and waste collection, all that stuff. They have very little actual power to change. They're the between fund how they raise funds for the municipality is only through property taxes and fees and fines and whatnot. There's very little actual power that a municipal councillor can do, which in my mind opens it up to, well, if I can't really do anything, what am I going to do every day? And that kind of leads to, idle hands are the devil's playground kind of mentality. And I'm wondering, like, do we need to start putting more responsibility on municipal governments to say, like, no, like the decisions you make or don't make have real consequences for the communities that we live in, and that people start taking a closer look at the actions of their municipal government a lot more closely than we currently do.
Well, that's a really interesting take. I would say I don't share the same view. I actually think in general, and this is a very generalized statement, but in general, I think in many communities, I think counselors are the most underpaid people working. I think they're extremely busy. I think it really depends on probably the individual counselor, but I've seen mayors that are at every single possible business opening, community event, youth group, counselors that are just out there advocating, creating really important grassroots social change. And so I would say that I don't actually think that this is a matter, I don't think misbehavior is a matter of not having enough to do. I think it measures to address poor behavior when it happens. The whole idea behind this legislative push is that hopefully nobody ever has to be removed. The idea is that when people come forward, things can be addressed quickly. They can be addressed, before escalating, and so that we're actually curbing this behavior as it happens, as opposed to waiting until instances become egregious and then we have to take it through a whole system. So that would maybe be more my take on that particular piece.
Fair enough. Next point I want to examine was just, why do you think it's taken so long to kind of get where we are? We've been treading our wheels on this. As you said, there was Bill 5 in the previous provincial session.
Yep.
Now we're on Bill 9 in this current one. Yet we don't seem to be really. I know you're advocating, and there are other groups out there that are advocating for this bill or some kind of legislation be put forward, but we still seem to just kind of be spinning our wheels on this. And I'm wondering why is that? The current government has been in for, we're coming on 9, will be in 10, they'll be in 10 years in power. And we haven't seen any, this isn't a new problem.
Yes.
Why are we still in the let's talk about it phase?
Yeah. Misogyny, I would say. This is getting captured. They want to. And we know this because they introduced the Strong Mayors Building Homes Better Act within 4 weeks. So when they're motivated, it's going to happen. That said, yes, things take time. And that, I think in this particular case where this will be quite precedent setting across Canada, I understand that it's important to take time in committee and to make sure that those, there's due process in that way. But to your point, this is not new. One, again, certainly with gender-based violence, how many women have to die? How many women have to be beat up, burned to death, assaulted, violated, abused, harassed? And I say women because overwhelmingly, even in regards to this legislation, the majority of victims are women. The majority of perpetrators are men. That said, we have many, many male allies. So it's not to suggest that a female cannot perpetrate, and I'm using binary terms, but this applies to people of all genders. The benefit of this legislation is it will affect all persons. But the reason it has not been enacted is that there's a high level of protectionism happening throughout the province and certainly within communities. And we're seeing that playing out in real time. And it's very strong, very difficult to penetrate. And yet, municipally elected reps know that when the voter hears about this, people have been so disturbed to think that municipally elected reps are held to a lower standard when it comes to their conduct than every other working Ontarian. And so what we have found is that once we get in front of municipalities, there's always full support for the motion, simply because they know that the voter expects better.
I'm wondering if you're successful on this and you get this legislation put forward within this term. This is kind of the framework could be expanded to just the provincial as well as the federal level in terms of holding that those individuals accountable as well. And I'm wondering, like, do you think that's at play here? That if it's shown to work at the municipal level, you're going to have like over 600 examples of it in Ontario, and if it seems to be working well, then the push could be said, okay, we'll put this into work at Queen's Park, and Ottawa will do its own, Parliament will do its own thing, but the owners can then say, Queen's Park, hold yourselves to the same standard as Barrie, Hamilton, Mississauga, or Toronto, even.
100%. I think it's a really stark reminder that elected representatives are of the people. They are not above the people. So it absolutely should apply to every level of politics in this country. I think this will be a great litmus test. It's important that, there's protections against vexatious claims. That's something that we're also advocating for. We want to make sure that it is not weaponized against, differing political views. And this is why our focus has always been violence and harassment, because these are very obvious instances where things are just not appropriate. But absolutely, this needs to happen. And it's really interesting because people would argue or have argued, okay, but there's a party structure, so they can kick somebody out of their caucus.
Right.
Well, great, good, but that person is still representing the community after they've harassed somebody, and it's been substantiated. And if it's egregious, then we're arguing that no, you don't get the privilege. I mean, representing the people is a privilege. It is not a right, and it is something that is earned. And it's important that people are held accountable, because that's how we instill trust in elected representatives.
And I'm going to play devil's advocate here, because on its surface it sounds reasonable. If I'm harassing you, if I'm bullying you in the workplace, there should be, we say, well, you just fire that person. The question though is, somebody did elect you, me, or whomever to that position. Somebody does want that person sharing their viewpoint in the elected chamber. They went through the legal process of doing it. They ran, they got the votes, they get to represent the riding, ward, whatever. Removing them, I see where you're coming from. I'm just purely devil's advocate. Like, that's a big step. Is removing that voice from the elected assembly is a huge step. And should that person then be able to run again in a by-election to say, yeah, I got railroaded, this is BS, and send me back with even stronger mandate, and I'm going to tell them what for. What do you say to that argument?
What a great argument. Yeah. And you know what? I think I really appreciate, I do appreciate the apprehension behind it. But, again, when you're representing a group of people, group of citizens, a group of your community, again, this is not about the same, someone has elected you because of the same political views, but they have not elected you to go and, harass somebody or be violent towards them. And I think that that's a big difference. So anyone who is removed, in those cases, we're talking about the most egregious of circumstances. We are not talking about hearsay. It's not a vendetta. These would have to be investigated, substantiated claims that are then corroborated by a provincial IC and a judge. So we are talking about a very high level of scrutiny. And again, the idea being that hopefully this is never actioned. So we do believe that any person that is removed would be barred from running in the following election, especially because it could be a 4-year term and they could be removed in the last 6 months. We do not feel it would be appropriate. Like if you were, working at a meat packing plant and you were found guilty of harassment that led to your termination, the meatpacking plant just doesn't go around and rehire you again 3 months later. So I think we have to be really careful. It's democracy, but democracy works well when you have all three branches working at the same time. And one of that is the judiciary. That's what makes a healthy democracy. That's why, we can look at our neighbors to the south, and there's, lawsuits and laws to, in theory, keep elected reps in check. Because it's not just democracy or bust. We have to have laws that we agree on communally and social norms and expectations. And so when we think about even the development of laws, it's because a group of people said, you know what, this isn't okay. This is not okay. So we need to change this. And that's how laws and, regulations and all of these codes of conduct, et cetera, are created. So it's not, we can't look necessarily to the law to lead community. We have to look at ourselves and look at the change that we want to make and then make the changes accordingly.
We're coming up on our time here. So I just want to ask you, where are we on this right now? I know we're at I think this is the third kick the can to get something put through the legislature. This is Bill 9. Where are we on Bill 9 status in the legislature?
Holy smokes, Joel, great question. And I really hope for the sake of communities that this gets passed quickly. So it has just finished its committee hearings, which means it's passed second reading. They will take all of the feedback from the committee hearings. They will make the necessary changes, and then they will introduce it again for third reading. So the idea is we do need this to be passed next municipal election. That's critical, and it has to be passed with the necessary changes. And one thing that I'll share is currently a provincial IC recommendation for removal is slated to come back to council. And in its current form, the legislation stipulates that it would have to have unanimous council support in order for that recommendation to be actioned. That is completely inappropriate. You would never invest in a system that could be derailed by one person at the very end because they were buddies with somebody. So that absolutely needs to be changed to a threshold, still a high threshold of 2/3, if the government is going to keep council involved, which we are actually advocating that it go to a panel and then for judicial review. But if council is going to be involved at all, that threshold absolutely has to be changed to 2/3, or else the entire legislation will be moot. And this will, be considered a waste of time. So it'll be very interesting to see what the next move is. But I do want to give credit where credit is due. It is introduced. Traditionally, this government, if they introduce something, they will follow through on it. So we are absolutely expecting that those necessary changes are made so that the legislation does achieve its intended outcome.
I agree that the effectiveness of this government is to be determined, in my opinion. But I'll leave it to you. My one worry would be if this legislation falls underneath like the strong mayor's powers. Like if this is if this process is able to be kind of derailed or manipulated by the strong mayor's powers in the final legislation, what would would you accept that as like kind of like a imperfect victory? Or would this be something
that would be atrocious. No, that would be atrocious. The strong mayor powers is, arguably one of the most undemocratic pieces of legislation that we've ever seen. We need to have something that is robust, sound, and fair and transparent. So no, we would consider a win for us would be having this legislation passed. If they're going to continue council involvement, changing that threshold to 2/3, not putting it under the strong mayors. In fact, this legislation is even more critical because they granted the strong mayors powers. It's very, very incongruent that you would give municipally elected reps more power in community and less accountability. So, especially when it comes to the treatment of others, the very basic treatment of others. So that's where we stand on that piece.
All right. Well, I will leave it at that for the last word on this topic. Thank you very much, Emily McIntosh from. Sorry. Thank you, Emily McIntosh, for coming on today and sharing this with us. Best of luck to you, and we'll see how this unfolds over the coming months.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me.